Ladies and gentlemen, we just had the first round of the college football playoff happen, and none of the games were close. The home teams won every single one of them. The closest spread was Ohio State minus 7.5. So all these games were, they had pretty large spreads, and the home team covered every single one. And I'm going to be reacting to these games and then talking about the next round. And the next round is New Year's 6 games. It's 4 different ones. It's the exact same setup to where there's one game on New Year's Eve, and then there's 3 games on New Year's Day. So there's one game at night on New Year's Eve, and then 3 games on New Year's Day. So when it comes to this, I'm going to go through these games. A lot of people talking about the format. It needs to change. They definitely need to switch the seeding going into next year. And then I think it's guaranteed to expand in 2026. So we're probably only going to get 2 years of this 12-team playoff. They want more games. It's going to make them more money. And then the expansion to the 14-team, people are going to get angry about that. They're saying we should go back to the 4. We should go to the 8. What's with all these games? They're blowouts. They're not competitive. Guys, these are just extra games for us to watch. And look, I understand the regular season argument, the idea it's devaluing it. We can talk about that in another video, but let's just get to these games here. So Texas versus Clemson. I know people were saying that Clemson, they had a valiant effort. They had no running backs. All their running backs got hurt. They had to play a receiver at running back. Texas ends up winning 38-24. Clemson made it competitive early in the fourth quarter. They scored a few touchdowns, but Texas was really in control of most of this game. And they were sitting, they finished 13-point favorites. They end up winning by 14, so they do cover that spread. And now they're going to face Arizona State. And this is where it becomes a bit ridiculous. So Arizona State gets a bye, and now they're 13.5-point underdogs. So Texas, in their 2 playoff games, both of the spreads have been 13 points. Is that right? You're 13 point. These are playoff games. They're supposed to be huge. Texas, basically 2 touchdown favorites in both of these games. So listen, I think Texas is going to beat Arizona State. To me, it's very similar to Clemson. Arizona State is, where I think Arizona State's going to do some things against Texas. They're a fun little team, but Texas is just going to out-talent them and outclass them. And Sarkisian has those players playing very disciplined football. And so I think, especially Texas, they're like a complete team. Ewers has been a little off and on, but in general, Texas, they ran the ball amazing against Clemson, and they've got a good enough defense. You could argue top 5 in the country. I think they'd beat Arizona State. How about this game? Ohio State, Tennessee. So this was definitely the game that had the most hype because Ohio State, the #1 brand, Tennessee, their first time in a huge game in almost like 2 decades, over 2 decades, I think. Tennessee, at least when it comes to like a bowl game, this isn't technically a bowl game, but Tennessee talked a lot of crap and they didn't back it up. And it was kind of funny when it comes to like the whole idea of it being cold, because I know everyone's like making a big deal about it. People in the Big Ten were like, these SEC people can never come and play in the cold. And then they kind of made fun of that. Tennessee came out with their shirts off like they were trying to prove something. And it was very funny to see Ohio State just crush them immediately, go up 21-0. It could have been 28-0, by the way. There was a pass interference, but it doesn't really matter. Ohio State, Tennessee did try and come back. Their receivers their top 2 receivers ended up getting hurt. Their starting running back, who was all SEC, got injured. Honestly, I think probably because of the cold. It seemed like their muscles were tightening up because of the cold, which is kind of ironic considering they were saying the cold wasn't going to affect them. But it was a blowout. And also you had Tennessee fans try and take over Ohio Stadium. And I will say, in listening to the crowd noise, there was definitely, you could argue, 25% Tennessee fans. I know people were saying it was 30. It was going to be 40%, 50%. It wasn't that. The entire student section was full Ohio State, and it was kind of hard to see between the orange and the scarlet because Ohio State had the scarlet out. But this just goes to show you how bad this format is. Oregon is the only undefeated team in the regular season. Their first game in the playoff, they're underdogs. Come on. Really, Oregon should get to choose their opponent. They were the only undefeated team. And Oregon right now should be facing, I would imagine they would pick either Boise State or Arizona State. And it's almost a gimme win. This format is just makes no sense. Ohio State sitting -2.5 against Oregon. Oregon could very easily beat Ohio State again. That's going to be an amazing Rose Bowl game. But it's very hard to beat a team twice, especially a really good team. But Georgia did prove that you can do it against Texas. I don't know. It's a bad format. It's unfortunate for Oregon. You could argue Oregon gets more rest, so they've got a leg up on Ohio State, but Ohio State needed a performance like that against Tennessee. They come out, they throw the ball. Will Howard was really good. Jeremiah Smith is unguardable. Trevion Henderson is coming into his own, becoming one of the. I mean, he looks like the best running back in college football right now. And Ohio State's defense is just so talented. So, I mean, to be fair, Tennessee was missing some players. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think that really would have mattered. But it just goes to show you how bad the format is. Ohio State sitting 2.5-point favorites against the number one team, the only undefeated team. Oregon should be facing Arizona State right now. And it's just how the format is, which is why I think the format's going to be changed. Penn State crushes SMU. Probably both of these games were terrible. I mean, really all four of the games were not good, but these two games in specific, this game was just not competitive. SMU's quarterback threw 2 pick sixes. Penn State went up 14-0. It was not close. It was the noon game. The entire second half the game was already known, who was going to win. So, I mean, Penn State, they got an amazing draw. As the 6th seed, you face SMU. SMU immediately self-destructs with 2 pick sixes, 2 turnovers, and a very easy win for Penn State. Penn State's got a solid team. They've got a good offense, a really good defense, and I think they're going to shut down Genty and Boise State. UNLV shut down Genty. They held him to like 3.5 yards per carry. I think that's what Penn State's going to do. Penn State doesn't lose to teams like Boise State. They when they're facing more talent, it tends to be a problem for James Franklin to get over the hump against an Ohio State or a Michigan. But against a team like Boise State, Penn State's a disciplined football team. They've got a good run defense, and also Penn State's got a good enough offense. They really didn't need to use it against SMU. They only had like 330 total yards, but that's because of the pick sixes, and you just sit on the ball in the second half. But them facing Boise State, they got an amazing draw. They're 10.5-point favorites in that game. And then you've got Notre Dame and Indiana. This was another terrible game. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it was 27-3. That was basically the final. Indiana scored really late garbage touchdowns. And, I mean, that was the game where Kirk Herbstreit said some things about Ohio State fans that were just inaccurate. But you've also got Kirk Herbstreit declaring that Indiana did not belong. They did not deserve to be in the playoff during this game against Notre Dame. I don't know why Kirk Herbstreit calls like 10 games every week. It's like one is enough. But he said that, they didn't deserve to be in the playoff. Indiana fans got angry. I mean, and then you can see how Tennessee performed against Ohio State. Indiana, you don't want to do the transitive property thing, but Indiana did perform better against Ohio State than Tennessee did. It is what it is. At the end of the day, Indiana did not have one single good win, and they laid a complete egg against Notre Dame. They got an early interception off Riley Leonard, but it was nothing after that. My concern with Notre Dame is still the passing offense. I mean, they just had way more talent than Indiana. They could run the ball very easily. Listen, this is going to be an interesting game, Notre Dame versus Georgia, and it's a great opportunity for Notre Dame. Georgia's sitting 1.5-point favorites. Nobody really knows what to expect from the backup quarterback there for Georgia, Stockton, although I think he should be all right. I mean, he's been with that program multiple years. Notre Dame, on the other hand, I'm just concerned about Notre Dame's receivers and their passing attack. So we'll have to see with that game, but it should be very close. It should be a good game, and it's an opportunity for Notre Dame to beat Georgia's been the best SEC team the past like 5 years. So, and they just won the SEC, even with all their injuries. And you're basically in a pick'em game against them. They're going to have the crowd advantage, though, you would figure. I know Notre Dame's a big program, but with where that game's located, it seems like Georgia is always playing these games in SEC country, whether it's the Caesar Superdome, whether it's Mercedes-Benz. We got another national title game at Mercedes-Benz. It is what it is, but you can see that game going to be very, very good. So, listen, we can discuss the format. We can discuss, is 12 teams the right amount? People saying it needs to go back down to 4 teams. The regular season is meaningless. I think that's kind of a dumb argument. You want to talk about the regular season being meaningless? Look at Ohio State's reaction to losing to Michigan. And by the way, that's a meaningless game, basically, because Ohio State was still going to make the playoff anyways. But the loss to Michigan, even though the game didn't matter because they were still making the playoff, it was so meaningful. I mean, you saw what happened, the reaction, Tennessee fans trying to take over Ohio Stadium, in large part because Ohio State lost as 20-point favorites. I still think the regular season matters. We have to avoid what was happening every single year in those New Year's Six games when players would sit out, the non-playoff New Year's Six games. You saw what happened Ohio State, Missouri last year. Ohio State starting their third-string quarterback. FSU, Georgia game was horrific. There's plenty of other examples. And so I like the more inventory. It is weird how it's done. Like, there's just no way Texas, 13.5-point favorites against Clemson, 13.5-point favorites against Arizona State. Really? Texas lost their conference championship game. Oregon won theirs. They get a bye, and then they get Ohio State as underdogs. So it just doesn't make any sense. And then Penn State gets a much better draw than Oregon, and they lost to Oregon, SMU, and Boise State. And then you could argue whether or not Georgia or Texas is better, or Ohio State. That's an argument for another day. I mean, it's hard to really say right now, but the format is bad, and whether you want to reseed the teams after the first round, or I think they need to change it completely and remove the auto bids and just take the 12 best, which is going to anger people because they're going to perceive a bias towards the SEC and the Big Ten. And SEC fans were talking a lot, and then Tennessee got spanked, and that kind of shut them up a little bit. Ohio State beating Tennessee by the amount they did, I don't think anyone really expected it, but it was a very impressive win to go up 21-0 in the first quarter. And again, you're 2.5-point favorites against Oregon, the Rose Bowl game. And that should be like a 50-50 crowd, by the way. I think it'll be 50-50. Penn State, Boise State, that game's out west. Yeah, that game is that's the night game, the 31st. And then the other 3 games are on the 1st. This is the really late game on the 1st, 8:45. The Ohio State game, obviously, it's going to be on at 5 o'clock, with it being the Rose Bowl. This is the 1 o'clock game, Arizona State, Texas. I think is that at AT&T Stadium? Oh, it's at Mercedes-Benz. I was going to say that would have been a huge advantage for Texas. I think the Cotton Bowl is at Mercedes-Benz, or it's at AT&T. Yeah, so that could be a big advantage for Texas being at AT&T. I mean, Ohio State and Oregon should travel well, but Texas should have a okay advantage in terms of maybe like 60-40 crowd. But those first round games were not good. Would it have been more entertaining to see Alabama face Penn State? Yes, it would have, let's be honest. But it is what it is. I mean, the regular season has to matter. If you lose to Oklahoma 24-3, that's a game you have to win. You already have 2 losses if you're Alabama. Win that game, beat Auburn, and you're in. So who do you really blame there? But they're definitely going to restructure things when it comes to the seeding, I'll tell you that much, because these games were not good. And the questions are, should SMU been in? Should Indiana have been in? I mean, Indiana lost 1 game. Now, the problem is it's just the schedule was so bad for Indiana, and there is an argument for punishing Indiana's horrible non-conference schedule. And I know a lot of teams have really bad non-conference schedules, but it's different when you also dodge every single good team in your conference outside of Ohio State, and then you lose to Ohio State by like 3 scores. And your non-conference schedule is an FCS team and then 2 horrible Group of 5 teams. So you could have punished Indiana for that, but it's like they're still 11-1 and their only losses on the road at Ohio State. So I don't really know. It is what it is, but that is just the setup here in the second round. And again, these are New Year's 6 games. It's kind of weird because I guess some teams are going to be playing 2 New Year's 6 games, which it is what it is. It kind of ruins the whole New Year's 6 thing and the appearances and the amount of games, but it is what it you can see the Capital One Orange Bowl, but that is the current setup, and it's all out of whack. Arizona State facing Texas, Ohio State facing Oregon, going to be an amazing game. Penn State, Boise State, I think Penn State should, with Boise State being one-dimensional, win that game. Notre Dame, Georgia. Notre Dame, Georgia, and Ohio State, Oregon are going to be very good games, we would imagine. Not sure what to expect from Georgia with the quarterback situation. Not sure if Carson Beck is out for the entirety of the playoff. But if Georgia wins this game, you would have to figure Penn State's a solid team, but the winner of this game, Notre Dame or Georgia, is probably going to be the favorites against Penn State, just because Notre Dame has really good analytics, and Georgia, they've got just a more talented roster than Penn State. But Penn State's a sound team. We'll see. I mean, there's a chance Penn State, with this almost gimme game against Boise State, they're 1 win away from going to the national title. And that's just the setup of the bracket. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.